Even though India is not being measured through the survey, it's interesting to take a look at some of the considerations that they're looking at under this particular AEO and mutual recognition survey. So, we're well into the life of the private sector consultative group, and that's where we started, focus on supply chain security, but we've noticed in our group that we have a level of what I guess I'd call security fatigue. People are looking for other kinds of facilitation efforts, and business really wants to continue the broader dialogue with customs administrations and with the World Customs Organization about what those broader issues and more strategic issues at this point perhaps should be. So the PSCG's interests have really been evolving in the last year or two to include strategic and business investment concerns, and primarily through the World Customs Organization Policy Commission. The Policy Commission is sort of the executive body of the WCO, includes about 27 different countries. Membership sometimes rotates. All of the regional vice chairs are represented there. But it's a very high-level group of directors general of customs administrations. And again, we're delighted that the PSCG meets with the Policy Commission twice a year, once in June. In fact, I'm going directly from here to Brussels to do that, and then once in December. There's a growing awareness on the part of customs administrations that borders matter to business, and borders matter to business in terms of how goods move across borders and whether or not business is going to invest in your country. And let me give you an example of that. I mentioned Pfizer, again, a large pharmaceutical global manufacturer. Pfizer did a study that looked at the World Bank's Logistics Performance Indicator list, and it looked at the countries in which it had significant costs of warehousing and inventory. And the least efficient countries were the countries in which Pfizer had the most significant costs in terms of inventory maintenance. Now, they obviously don't want to build warehouses. They don't want to keep things on hand. They want to invest in countries where they have some predictability and certainty in terms of moving their product across its borders. So that's the transition that we're in, I think, where more and more customs administrations are understanding that efficient borders and clear processes and transparent processes do contribute to a country's prosperity because it directly influences business investment decisions. So we were asked to do, as the PSCG, an annex to the World Customs Organization orientation package for decision makers. Now, the orientation package itself is really to help customs administrations, again, this is for WCO members, it's not a business document, help customs administrations secure political will in their countries for the operation of customs departments. Because we find in many, many countries of the world, customs may have the best intentions, but customs departments are not adequately funded. They don't have the political recognition in terms of understanding how important the border role is and the border function is. So again, the WCO developed an orientation package for decision makers. We thought it was an excellent document, and then we volunteered to make some commentary as an annex to it. And in fact, that is what we're going to be discussing in a week's time in Brussels, is the annex that we've prepared. Well, what we tried to do for World Customs Organization and its members is to identify some priorities of business in crossing borders and what business expects of trade facilitation measures. And again, this is really important work, and it's really, I think, helpful to everybody in this room. Because what it talks about is what's needed for a country to be considered open for business. And again, I get back to that theme of why border efficiency is important. Many countries are so focused on revenue collection and on barriers that maximize, they think, revenue collection, that they don't recognize that trade facilitation is the true answer in terms of increasing volumes of trade, creating jobs in a country through investment, and ultimately greater prosperity than simple revenue collection through tariffs at the border would generate. So it's an interesting paper, it's an interesting piece of work, and I just want to take a few minutes to talk about what it is. So in the annex, we provided some thoughts on 4 elements which we thought were very important in terms of trade facilitation, in terms of how business works, and in terms of what customs should pay attention to. The first one is transparency, the second is predictability, the third is efficiency, and the fourth is engagement with the private sector. So we also thought, it's good to have generalities about trade and about all the benefits of trade, and a lot of organizations write a lot of stuff about that, but we wanted to provide some good practices or best practices that we thought were practical examples of what customs could do to ensure their countries were in fact open for business. So let's talk about transparency first. So one of the things that's most basic, and I think you had a session this morning, the value of published customs rulings. And again, this could be classification, it could be valuation, but there's huge advantages to a customs administration and to business in terms of transparency if customs rulings are published. We also wanted customs administrations to pay greater attention to the need for intellectual property enforcement, and particularly respect for the role of rights holders. And I must say that in my own country, in Canada, we have lagged far behind in terms of our attention to IPR and international intellectual property rights. So again, we've got some new legislation, but the record of the world is not the best in terms of IPR, and it's an increasing concern with things like counterfeit medicines and other sorts of concerns. The third thing with transparency is what we call a small business lens checklist, or it could just be called a business lens checklist. And we've suggested a template whereby if customs administrations are implementing a regulatory requirement, they would go through a certain questionnaire checklist to really identify the impacts on business. And if it was burdensome and negative and costly, again, that does no one any good in terms of efficiency. So again, this is something that we have suggested as a good practice or as a best practice for customs administrations to look at. We're not suggesting that it will be magical, that administrations or governments will say, oops, this is costly to business, we can't implement that. But at least it will raise awareness of the impacts of what the regulatory requirement or obligation is and what it costs business in a negative sense, and hopefully we'll let them take a second look at it. Predictability is another factor that, again, we wanted to raise with customs administrations, and one of the things we said was predictability in terms of the benefits of opportunities to adjust or correct after the release of goods. That could be a valuation issue where in many countries, if you don't, there's no opportunity to adjust or correct. There's absolute punitive action taken, and again, not a positive thing at all from a business perspective. Our colleagues from New Zealand raised the next point, which was the need to promote consistency during negotiation and after implementation of free trade agreements. You've all seen and you all know that there are more and more and more bilateral free trade agreements that are being negotiated, and you also know that they don't look the same language isn't used, and that they are increasingly complicated in terms of the administration of the free trade agreements. So again, we're suggesting that consistency is important, and that there needs to be actually, we did suggest that there needs to be engagement of the private sector even during the negotiation of free trade agreements, which certain countries are open to and certainly certain countries are not. Efficiency, the value of multi-agency harmonization and single windows. From an efficiency point of view, I can say that we've been talking about single window in Canada probably for 20 years now, and we still don't have one. So I sometimes think that developing customs administrations are much more likely to be able to implement efficient single window processes because they don't have legacy systems that they need to adapt. But certainly, even if we meet all of the customs requirements, there are still requirements of other government agencies for health, for safety, for other sorts of things. So in terms of an efficient border process, governments need to look at multi-agency harmonization and single windows. More and more and more in terms of global business, there's a real concern with transfer pricing and a need for positive efforts to resolve customs valuation conflicts with tax laws. Again, we've got some examples of best practice in our document that would be beneficial, but I know that in some countries business spends a lot of time talking about this and trying to resolve it, and it's a very costly process in terms of the difficulties that companies have reflecting transfer pricing and rationalizing their pricing with customs valuation. The implementation of centers of excellence was something else that we thought was a good idea. It's been done recently in the United States by their Customs and Border Protection Service, and this is where Customs centralizes its industry expertise. So pharmaceutical, automotive, aeronautics, all of those kinds of things. So I think there's about 7 in the United States now. The last one just opened up recently. Customs can then train its officers, develop expertise, and business and you can know exactly where to go, again, depending on the industry sector. So we thought that was another good practice that Customs administration should consider. Implementation of AEO benefits, I've talked again a bit about that, and we'd go back to the paper we initially wrote in terms of what those benefits might be. The importance of consistency and harmonization and people understanding what they're going to get, and the benefits being tangible and measurable. We also have made statements that we don't want customs administrations rolling back existing good processes that all traders benefit from to set up something that really relates specifically to AEO, and we were concerned about that, certainly initially, even in the implementation of AEO programs. We're being required more and more to provide advanced data to customs administrations for risk assessment. So again, in terms of efficiency, we've talked about advanced cargo risk assessment strategy and filing mechanisms in the most constructive terms in the paper that we wrote. Simplification through paperless filing. Paperless filing is such a basic element in terms of some of the issues that we wrestle with at the border. I mean, it can relate to integrity issues that we talk about a lot at the World Customs Organization, all sorts of things, and basic simplification in terms of automated processes. Once again, in terms of efficiency, the importance of a focus on account-based processing, looking at companies, traders, service providers as entities rather than looking at transactions individually, and applying penalties perhaps individually. So that is something else from an efficiency perspective that's important to the PSCG. The final thing that we have talked about and written in our paper is the engagement and the importance of engagement of the private sector in decision making. Certainly in the session you had yesterday, I know that you are respected by your government, and I understand that there are opportunities for constructive engagement of the private sector with customs, but in many countries there are no mechanisms for customs business collaboration or for input in terms of decision making by customs. So again, we think that this is an absolute necessity in terms of how borders work. We've got some interesting examples of good practices. The first is a partnership in Brazil. This is our member Procomex that I referred to initially, where 72 associations in Brazil have been engaged by their customs administration in business process mapping. And again, I think that's an incredibly interesting example of engagement of the private sector, and I'll be very interested to see how that process evolves. Also in New Zealand, a process whereby business was invited to engage with their customs administration with their strategic plan. Again, an amazing kind of invitation for business to contribute, not just at the implementation stage, but at the planning stage in terms of defining the business of customs and coming up with a mission statement and all of those kinds of important strategic leadership issues. The implementation of consultative committees, we've recommended as a good practice as well. They benefit both customs and trade. And finally, it dawned on us when we've been having some of the discussions at the World Customs Organization that many customs administrations don't really understand fundamentally how business works. So what we've undertaken to do is to develop a series of business process maps based on the sectors that we have represented in the private sector consultative group. And I mean, again, you saw who's at the table, whether it's food, which is Fonterra, whether it's General Motors and Renault Nissan, which is automotive, whether it's Pfizer, which is pharmaceutical. In each of those business processes, customs has particular points of intervention at the borders, and customs has particular points of pain for those industry sectors in terms of how customs administers its requirements. With many of those industry sectors, there's also the intervention of other government agencies, again, for health, for safety, for permits, for other things. So we felt it was important, both to the World Customs Organization Secretariat and also to our own customs administrations, to try and develop these business process maps in terms of what customs administrations need to understand about how business works, because again, even in the most developed economies, we don't think that customs administrations fully understand how business works and what business needs, and we think this will help. Now, I have to show you this particular slide. If you look in the lower left-hand corner, there's a cow, and the cow's in New Zealand. And if you look in the top right-hand corner, there's a buyer of, again, our member Fonterra's product, probably in Saudi Arabia. And again, this is an interesting slide because this is their supply chain and this is their process. Now, one of the guys from Fonterra tells me that he can't explain this to me when I asked him if he could try. But again, it does show the complexity of business process and a complexity that, again, we think customs doesn't fully understand. So that's our next project. We will make the annex for the orientation package available to you, and again, through your representative on IFCBA, Shantanu, and we'd be happy to receive your contributions back from FFFAI. I know you work very hard in terms of what you do and have a very sophisticated understanding of how business works. So again, as customs brokers globally, I think it's important that we continue to participate in the private sector consultative group, continue to take advantage of the opportunity that the PSCG offers us for leadership and respect at the World Customs Organization, and continue to be inclusive in terms of our members and their needs and how we make our representations to the World Customs Organization and its Secretary General. So that's my part, and I know Michel Vallée will continue on with some more information about the WCO and its economic competitiveness package. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Carol. Carol serves as secretary of the IFCBA, and through the years, I mean, she's made very significant contributions to our work, and also she has always worked to raise in the profile of customs brokers in all the different organizations where she participates. Thank you, Carol. We are going to have probably a space for a couple of minutes. Excuse me, it's going to be the same presentation, no change. Just if you leave it where it was, we'll just take it from there. Thanks. Yes, and we are going to have a space for a couple of questions now directly to the presentation that Carol has just made. I don't know if there's anybody that may have a question. There's one on here on the left in the front. I don't know if there's a microphone.
Hello. I think the SME business in the current scenario requires a lot of support on the temporary imports which they make. I mean, would the WCO or the customs team how do they support this type of an activity for temporary imports which gets made into foreign exhibitions or anything like that? Any temporary imports that gets made from one country to another country, then it has to go back without payment of duty, or if there is some easier way to handle such transactions.
Excuse me, it seems that the volume is very low. I don't know if you see it could be raised. Could you repeat your question, please? Yeah.
I'm sorry. Well, the question was related to the support which the WCO can give for temporary imports that gets made into any of the countries, like, you know, in the exhibition industries, where for an SME, where he wants to get some shipments to be brought into a country for a temporary demonstration or something like that, where how does the customs would value that temporary import, and what type of easier formalities that could be set right for the importers and for the customs brokers?
I think I have understood the question. All these things are given in Kyoto 2 version of Kyoto Convention. So temporary imports in India and re-export of temporary imports or re-import of exported is extremely difficult today. And even in Kyoto Convention first version and second version, there is a guidance for particular simplification, and it's quite simplified, be it carne or outside carne. So I think WCO has already made it simpler.
I would add, though, that even though there is guidance provided in instruments like the revised Kyoto Convention, we believe that there should be some monitoring of the implementation. It's not just that countries need to agree to the revised Kyoto Convention. We're encouraging that there be a monitoring to see how effectively the revised Kyoto Convention has been implemented, because in situations, I think, like you're talking of, I think many countries' economic policies develop how restrictive or not restrictive they are with respect to these processes. However, if they sign and accede to the revised Kyoto Convention, there is an obligation on the country to simplify procedures, but we're not sure that that's being effectively done in all of the countries that have acceded to the revised Kyoto Convention. So that's something we want to monitor also as the PSCG.
Yeah, thank you. There's another question here.
My name is Samir. I had a question. There's been a lot of discussion in India on the AEO, and you also made a lot of comparisons, and you talked about different things. My question was, how many brokers in a country like yours would have actually gone in for the AEO process, and how difficult or simple is it for a broker to get an AEO status? Before you say something, I'd like to see, in India, what we had an experience, they came out with an AEO program, which was like one shoe fits all. So it was a total failure. They took another 1 year and they came out with a new AEO program where they had different shoe sizes for different people. But I don't think a custom broker has still today been certified for the AEO, or even the process has gone on. So my question coming back is, what is the percentage of brokers who apply? How simple is it? And are there real benefits, or are there only benefits which one sees on a piece of paper?
I'll start the response to that question, and then I'll ask Michelle, and I'll actually ask Kiko Zuniga to also help me out here. In Canada, and I've just gone across the country at regional meetings, so I've spoken to all of my members across Canada this year, and that was one of the questions I asked, was how many of them were participants and had been approved for our AEO program. And the vast majority of customs brokers in Canada have been approved for our Partners in Protection program. And the reason for that, again, is when I get back to talking about customs brokers, that our customs brokers don't see it as voluntary in a way. They see it as an essential part of them being able to provide service to their clients, is that they can offer the fact that they have AEO status. And I know Michelle's company is AEO certified in Canada, and certainly Kiko can talk about the United States. But Michelle.
Thank you, Carol. As Carol has just mentioned, while becoming an AEO is not mandatory, for a customs broker it is mandatory, because we'll have at least one of our customers that say, if you want to do business with me, you need to be AEO. Now, how difficult is it? There is a specific AO program for customs brokers in Canada, which is different than the AO program for a carrier or an importer or a warehouse keeper. And it is quite extensive. You have to spend some money to become an AEO because you have to, depending if you have a warehouse, you have to fence the warehouse, you need to have cameras, you need to have badges to get into your facility. So there are some money to be spent to become an AEO participant. The only benefit I can say that we have seen yet is we get customers because they want to do business with an AEO customs broker. The only other benefit I would see is that we do have mutual recognition with the United States. So instead of having two validation processes, one from the United States and one from Canada, there's only one validation, and that is recognized by the other country. So I would say these are the only two benefits we see in Canada of being an AO participant.
Listen,
I have a corollary question after our friend finishes.
Okay. Just as far as the United States, we probably follow the same model that Carol and Michelle have mentioned, that customs brokers, it's almost a requirement. It's not really voluntary. While they say that the participation is voluntary, I agree with Michelle's statement. There's probably one of our customers that insists on us being an AEO status broker, or they'll change to a different broker. The benefits, we don't see that many benefits. We see it as an additional expense. But if you want to look at it in a positive way, which I try to do with most of what I do, it does improve the process of monitoring of your own office. You are more aware of the procedures that are being taken by your staff. So it does give some order to the operation of customs clearance and customs brokerage that in many shops may not exist otherwise. In a lot of cases, I think Carol mentioned it's almost like an insurance policy. We see it the same way. I question my insurance policy's worth all the time until I have a problem. And then I think the insurance policy is the best thing since sliced bread. So, you know, it all comes around in time, but the majority of the brokers in the United States are AEO. And as Michelle mentioned in Canada, how they have different processes or programs for different sectors of the industry, the same holds true in the United States. So brokers have a certain guideline, carriers a different one, freight forwarders different, importers and exporters different. So that does make it easier for a customs broker to qualify for that AEO status.
One thing which always disturbs, one thing which disturbs me is, since you deal with WCO, I never understood why they made it optional. If security was such a large concern, because it's only after security issues, concerns got raised that the AEO and all these programs come in. One thing is never clear to me, why did they make it optional? They could have just made it mandatory that anybody who wants to work as a custom broker must have so many processes. I think it would have made it much simpler, much cheaper, much easier for all brokers world over.
I guess that they didn't make it mandatory because you couldn't put people out of business if they could not comply or chose not to comply. So again, I think whether it's importers or exporters or customs brokers, again, people can still make the choice of whether or not they will become an AEO and whether they are prepared to make the investment, but you can't say that it's mandatory because you will force people out of business. I guess I'd also offer to provide to FFFAI the Canadian and American examples where customs brokers have a separate set of criteria and requirements that they have to meet, and that may be helpful for you in your own negotiations and discussions with your countries. So I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, shall we just continue with the presentation, because I think we still have 3 more speakers. And at the end, you see, we'll have another, if we have the time, to have another session of questions and answers. Michelle, He's a managing director for the ISCBA. He also serves as secretary and participates in the work of the PSCG on behalf of the ISCBA. Michel?
I'll just try to get back my presentation. Yeah, that's one.
This one?
Yeah. Thanks. So as you can see, technical difficulties happens in every part of the world, so I'm happy to see it also happens here in India. So before I start, I'll just get to my slide. Before I start, I just want to join my voice to my colleagues and thank Shantanu as well as the FFFAI organization